So now we're introduced, we'll move forward into Daniel chapter 8. And in Daniel chapter 8, in a sense, we go back a little bit and we look at a conflict between two of those empires, and then we're going to see actually another little horn. And we're going to study this little horn here and come to realize it's a different little horn. And what we're going to see today in Daniel chapter 8 is that God gives us a prophetic peek through what we might call a prototype. What you're going to see today is a prototype of this Antichrist and what he does. I don't know if anybody here has worked in maybe the aerospace industry or in the military, but if they have a bright idea or whatever, they make a prototype. Proto means first. Type is an example. It's a first example. So before you build the big plane, you build a little plane, and you go, here's a prototype. Here's what it's going to look like, and they could study it and do all the things that I don't really know anything about. But what we're going to see today is a prototype of the Antichrist, and we can learn from that. So Daniel chapter 8, he says in verse 1, the third year of the reign of Belshazzar. So now we see this is actually another vision. By the time he writes this, Belshazzar is dead. Okay, so we don't want to think chronology, we just want to think context here. But in verse 3, he says, then I lifted my eyes and looked, and behold, a ram, which had two horns, was standing in front of this canal, where he gets this vision. Verse 4 says, I saw the ram budding westward, northward, and southward, and no other beast could stand before him, nor was there anyone to rescue from his power, but he did as he pleased, and he magnified himself. Now, we could just, for a moment, it's a big chapter, and we're going to cover it all today, but for a moment, if we were to fast forward to verse 20, we actually get an interpretation here. It says, the ram which you saw with two horns represents the kings of the Medo-Persian Empire. So now we know who we're dealing with, no need to speculate, and if you can kind of follow the progression, Nebuchadnezzar's on top, he's the gold, and then there's the Medo-Persian Empire. And then verse 5 says, while I was observing, behold, a male goat was coming from the west over the surface of the whole earth, without touching the ground. There's your leopard with the wings. He comes flying in, he doesn't even touch the ground. And he has a conspicuous horn between his eyes. He came up to the ram that had two horns, which I had seen standing in front of the canal, and rushed at him in his mighty wrath. I saw him come beside the ram, and he was enraged at him, and he struck the ram and shattered his two horns, and the ram had no strength to withstand him. So he hurled him to the ground and trampled on him, and there was no one to rescue the ram from his power. And if we were to go to verse 21 briefly, the shaggy goat represents the kingdom of Greece, led by, very famous, and everything, most of what you're going to hear today you find in your Bible, but you will also find it in your encyclopedia. This stuff is laid out in human history, but again, the Bible was written way before the encyclopedia. The male goat magnified himself exceedingly, but as soon as he was mighty, the large horn was broken, and in its place there came up four conspicuous horns toward the four winds of heaven. What we're talking about here is Alexander the Great, of course. Alexander the Great, his dad's name was Philip. He was a Macedonian king, and what he wanted for Alexander was to be brilliant and to be a brilliant leader. As a young boy, he actually was tutored and studied under Aristotle. Aristotle had learned from Socrates and Philo and some of these Greek thinkers. Now, on one hand, they were brilliant. And Alexander would learn from them and go on. He would take an army of 40,000 and he would defeat armies of 250,000. He was brilliant because he learned Western thought, or we call it Western thought. He learned Greek philosophy. This is really, really important. It is another thing. Our ability to rationalize, to stop and think, is not worldwide. And I don't say this to kind of say someone else are dumb. They're not. You have been exposed to Western Greek thinking and rationale, which you may not even realize does not exist in many parts of the world. In fact, I can tell you from firsthand experience, missionaries who go into third world countries that have not been exposed to this can struggle immensely. What is wrong with you people? Why can't you think rationally? Why can't you make a decision and do something rationally? For example, the people in the village we lived in, they actually, when we broke down, oh, there's the moon. Oh, that's a turtle. What do you mean it's a turtle? Yeah, one day he went to jump over the river, and he jumped and just kept going up, and now he's the moon. And you guys, I'm not trying to embarrass them, but that comes from a lack of education or a lack of Western thought. It drives missionaries to the end of themselves. Drive you absolutely nuts to see a 10-year-old kid with a compound fracture and bone sticking right through his calf muscle. And they're taking 2 or 3 days before they decide to go upriver and go and get this kid some help. And we're beside ourselves. They don't have, and again, I don't say that to throw them under the bus. I say it so we would realize how important that is and how exposed to thought. And anyway, that's the kind of thinking that Alexander the Great had. Interesting, Alexander the Great, though he is a leopard with wings, he was fast and powerful, but he didn't last very long. In one area, that, although brilliant, he did not have a succession plan in place. So when he died, he had 4 kings that are talked about here rise up behind him. Interestingly, Alexander the Great did at one point ride into Israel. He rode into Jerusalem. The high priest came out, introduced himself, and actually, according to a first century historian by the name of Josephus, shared with Alexander the Great that he knew he was coming because he was in the Bible. And Alexander the Great said, "What?" And this high priest explained to him the book of Daniel, and Daniel responded, and some of this we can't ever verify, okay? So there's a touch of conjecture here. Alexander the Great responded that he had a vision or a deja vu, and he saw that moment with the high priest before it ever happened. So Alexander the Great became a sympathizer with Israel, and he did not destroy them. He was actually pro-Israel, and he moved on. On his deathbed, he died young in his 30s. He took over the entire area in just a number of years. On his deathbed, they came to him. They said, "You're dying. There's no son yet who's even old enough or in the picture. Who do you want your kingdom to go to?" His response is fascinating. He said, "The mighty one." Now, our Jewish friends insist he was speaking about the Messiah who was introduced in the book of Daniel. All right, real quick. The mighty one would be another way of saying Gabor. Right? If you've heard me ramble on out of the book of Isaiah, the coming Messiah would be all these things. He would be mighty God. That's El Gabor. Alexander said he wanted his kingdom to go to Gabor. Now, we don't know what he meant, but our Jewish friends applaud the idea that he wanted his kingdom to go to the Messiah. He had no timeline. Of course, that decision was not up to him. But is that not fascinating, how God has interlinked human history? Entirely possible that next week or in the next few days, our buddy Glenn will step out of his body and possibly sit down in fellowship with the likes of Nebuchadnezzar, Belshazzar, and even Alexander the Great. We just don't know. At any rate, his 4 generals said absolutely not. All 4 of them said, "I'm the mighty one." And they proceeded to go into essentially a civil war. And as we get down and we look at verse 9, out of one of them came forth a rather small horn, which grew exceedingly great towards the south, toward the east, and toward the beautiful land. Now, we can cheat again if we go over and look at verse 22. The broken horn and the 4 horns that arose in his place represent 4 kingdoms, which will arise from his nation, although not with his power. And none of them were. They were not the thinker or the leader of Alexander the Great. Nevertheless, here you have this 4 kingdoms. All of this is verified in your encyclopedia or on a very quick Google search. Okay, we don't have to take the Bible, and we can verify with history. In the latter period of their rule, when the transgressors have run their course, a king will arise, insolent and skilled in intrigue. This is the king or the little horn of Daniel chapter 8. So you have the 4 generals take over. There's only 2 of them that are significant, Ptolemy and Seleucus. One was to the north, one was to the south. They were involved in a civil war, and their battlefield was Israel. Now, if we move forward through the text, and I will fast forward to verse 14, this individual, this little horn, he really attacks Israel, and he does so for 2,300 evenings and mornings. And then it says, then the holy place will be properly restored. As we try and figure out who this individual is, that gives us great insight to a king that came from the Seleucid dynasty. That's one of those generals. His name is Antiochus Epiphanes. Not a good guy. No real chance Glenn sets with him next week. This guy is the little horn from Daniel chapter 8. There are some commentaries or some people, as they read the Bible, they immediately assume that a little horn in Daniel chapter 7 and a little horn in Daniel chapter 8 must be the same guy. It's not. The little horn out of Romans chapter 7, the little horn out of Daniel chapter 7 is out of the Roman Empire. No ambiguity in the text, very, very clear. This little horn is out of the Grecian or the Greek Empire. They are not the same individual. It's important we understand that. So you might ask yourself a question, well, gosh, Lord, why would you put things so close like that where we could get confused by it? Well, it's not that confusing if you take the time and study it, but he did so, I believe, to use the little horn of Daniel chapter 8 as that prototype I talked about. So as we study this little horn, and we look and we go, oh my, this is going to happen all over again. This guy was one vile leader, probably second only to Hitler in the way he went after our Jewish friends. So let's take a look at some of what he does. Back in verse 9, Daniel chapter 8, verse 9, out of one of them came forth a rather small horn, which grew exceedingly great towards the south, toward the east, and yes, towards the beautiful land, which would be Palestine or Israel. It grew up to the host of heaven and caused some of the host and some of the stars to fall to the earth, and it trampled them down. This is why some people think that this is the Antichrist, because the verbiage there looks like it's something that happened in the heavens. If you study the scriptures, when star is used symbolically, it almost always refers to angels. And the reason, because the star or the brilliance that we see with an angel has the same root word. So this could actually be referring to some sort of angelic being. But as we read, when he does this, he stops the sacrifices. So I don't think it is, although there are passages in Scripture that have a double fulfillment. So, although it's referring to this king who's attacking Israel, behind that king is Satan. Even though he's not the Antichrist, he has the same boss. Satan has been trying to destroy the Jews ever since Genesis chapter 12, 13, 14, 15. Why? They are a huge utensil in the hand of God. As we speak today, there are missiles. The news media doesn't even want to cover it anymore, but they're lobbing missiles into Israel today, yesterday. My mom's actually there, so I'm like, Mom, you duck. This has been going on for thousands and thousands of years, because Israel was a chosen vessel to take the message of our God to the nations. We have to understand that. Now, when they rejected Jesus, he gave that task to the church, right? He said, Israel, he hardened them, he set them aside, and he said, I'm going to empower the followers of Jesus Christ to take the message to the nations, to the church. But when the last one comes in, Israel is put right back into his hands, and he finishes the program. They are a target. They've always been a target, and we'll come back to that in the future, especially as we study at the latter half of the summer and the fall, the book of Zechariah. So I would encourage you to keep attending. That is powerful stuff there. So what's the host of heaven? Well, if Israel was supposed to be this light to the nations, they actually were to host the Gentiles who through them were supposed to come and learn and know about Yahweh and his plan of redemption. They were the host of heaven, and people could come to the temple. Maybe a double fulfillment with the angelic battles. And then a couple commentaries, good authors point out the stars. If we go back to when God called Abram, when he decided to build this nation of Israel, he referred to them as the stars in heaven, right? The descendants of Abraham. So it wouldn't be that far out for us to realize that the stars there might in fact refer to Israel. I'm a little torn. I go back and forth. Gosh, I'm not sure exactly what's going on there. But he caused them to fall to the earth and trampled them down. Could be angelic, but I just think it's the Jewish people of the day, which he absolutely destroyed. At one point, he ordered 20,000 soldiers to go and ride on Jerusalem, and they killed between 40 and 80,000 Jewish people just because. It says he even magnified itself to be equal with the commander of the host, and it removed the regular sacrifice from him, and the place of his sanctuary was thrown down. Again, two possibilities. Did he go up against God himself and the commander of that host? Or who's in charge of the host? If the host is the Jewish folks, then this possibly was the high priest, and it actually fits history. What Antiochus Epiphanes did is I'm sure he was fully aware of Alexander the Great, and he wanted to be like him. So these kings are just not content to keep what they're doing local. So he grabs his army and he decides to ride north. The civil war had come from there anyway, of which he came out of, and he rides into Egypt ready to conquer. He is met by a Roman guard, a Roman cohort of soldiers, and they said, "Sir, you will go no further." And what we're seeing here is the rise of the Roman Empire. Antiochus Epiphanes was stopped in his tracks. He was confronted, he was humiliated, and he bowed down. He said, "Well, okay, I'll have to give this some thought." The guard walked up to him with a sword, drew a circle around Antiochus Epiphanes, and he said, "You will answer me before you leave this circle." There's your red line in the sand, right? He bowed down. He knew he was no match, so he left humiliated. He took it out on the Jews. This is when he ordered them slaughtered. He made practicing Judaism illegal, and this is insane, but he actually made circumcision illegal and came up with some bizarre way to try and reverse a circumcision, and some people were forced into that. Let's just move right on. Brutal, brutal man. Refused to let them make sacrifices in their temple and persecuted the Jews, probably just like at a level which Hitler did. At one point, he brought in a herd of pigs, and he ordered the high priest to sacrifice a pig to a statue of Zeus that he placed in the temple. And the high priest said, "Absolutely not." And so Antiochus Epiphanes ordered him butchered right on the spot, and he was beaten down. Very, very brutal man. Tens and tens of thousands of innocent Jewish men, women, and children were slaughtered at his hand. But he went too far. And all of God's people have that point. And so an individual by the name of Matthias Maccabee rose up, and they created a Jewish revolt, and they put an end to this through warfare. In fact, the reason I'm fairly convinced this isn't necessarily referring to angelic battles is because the dates 171 BC roughly to 164 BC match the 2300 days. It's that roughly 6+ year period. And at the end of that time, the Jewish people rose up and they kicked some booty. And when they did, they were able to somewhat restore the temple, because this guy decimated it, not only with the Zeus thing, but he smashed stuff, smeared pig blood on the altar, and really went after them. They fixed it somewhat, organized it, and won just a little bit of independence for just this much time, because Rome is a tidal wave and it's coming. They celebrate that with a holiday called Hanukkah, if you're not familiar with Hanukkah. If you want to read about this, and this is kind of unfortunate in some regards, because as Bible-believing Christians, we do not recognize Apocrypha as part of our scriptures. And the reason being is simple. Our Jewish friends never did, up to the point where they recognized the Old Testament Jewish Bible. The early church people, they never recognized it as scripture until people needed to use it to verify the direction they wanted to take Christendom. Okay? So when I say Christendom, everything underneath an umbrella that would claim Christ, we can call Christendom. Whether we would agree that this is a person who has trusted Jesus Christ for salvation and therefore is saved, or is this just a religionist? Underneath the umbrella of Christendom, you have saved, truly born-again Christians, and then you have a lot of other things that have different. A few organizations under Christendom use the Apocrypha. But because we don't study it that well, but some of it is good history books like Maccabees, which talks about this Jewish revolt and what is going on there, and that is why they celebrate Hanukkah. was to celebrate the victory from this individual. So if we fast forward now, let's look just a little bit more at him and at Israel and at is what to come. So over into Daniel chapter 8, verse 23, in the latter period of the rule, when the transgressions have run their course, excuse me, you know what? Let's not get there yet. Back to verse 12 and 13. The host will be given over to the horn along with the regular sacrifice, and it will be flung truth to the ground. Excuse me, I skipped that. I wanted to talk about that because the truth flung to the ground is probably the Jewish Bible or the Mosaic Law, which actually had the sacrifices listed in it. So he threw that to the ground, but it says that this will be given on account of the transgressions, it will be given over to him. What transgressions is that? Well, think about it. The whole reason our Jewish friends were in Babylonian captivity because of their ongoing violation of the covenant. So what we're doing now is we're fast forwarding and we're looking at this point, the book of Nehemiah, and other people have decreed that our Jewish friends could go back. They had gone back, but sin and rebellion is still in them. Therefore, God is continuing to let individual, like in this case, Antiochus Epiphanes, destroy them and refine them. And so literally we stand back sometimes and we fail to realize what life under that law really entailed. It was harsh. Does God allow individuals or peoples to enter into our life possibly in the same way to refine us, to prepare us? Absolutely he does. Now, we are not under their law. A lot of times Christians want to. We want to exhort people, and so we push really, really hard, and we bring people in. And I listened to a guy this week suggested anybody that does not keep the Sabbath on a Saturday is not really a Christian. I'm like, have you read the book of Romans? Have you read the book of Galatians? We are not under the same law. Nevertheless, we have this freedom in Christ, but God does still use, he disciplines those he loves, but by another standard. So what he did, he outlawed Judaism, he flung their Bible to the ground. And then it says in verse 13, then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to the particular who was speaking, how long will the vision about the regular sacrifice apply while the transgression causes this horror, so as to allow both the holy place and the host to be trampled? And that's where he says 2,300 days and nights, and that period is found in 171 to 164 BC. All right, now let's look forward where we were going here. He will destroy, verse 24, he will destroy mighty men and the holy people. Now remember, this is pre-shadowing prophetically the Antichrist. He is going to do the same thing again. And there's a lot of people who look at what our Jewish friends have gone through in the Holocaust of World War II. You go, is there any way that this fulfilled it? No, there isn't. If you go to the book of Zechariah, and I know we're going to end up going here, but I want to just point this out. In the book of Zechariah, chapter 13, it says, it will come about in all the land, declares Yahweh, that two parts, referring to Israel, two parts in it will be cut off and perish. But the third will be left in it, and I will bring the third part through the fire, refine them as silver is refined, and test them as gold is tested. They will call on my name, and I will answer them. I will say, they are my people, and they will say, the Lord is my God. What this is talking about is the end times. Israel will come to faith, but in that process, 2/3 of our Jewish friends will be cut off and will be killed by the Antichrist. 2/3 of Jewish people. And as we watch right now, our Jewish friends flock back to Israel. They're being gathered, and in a very real sense, you could see how this could happen. God has covenants promised to Jewish people. The 1/3 will fulfill that covenant. I say this to bring up, there is something, you probably heard the term called anti-Semitism. You see it in religion. You see it in Christendom under that big umbrella. I would say a major number of the players under that umbrella now consider themselves to be Israel. And when you hear people using this Bible saying that we are Israel and Israel has no business in that land, I want to caution you. You need not argue or debate that, but that can lead to some anti-Semitic thoughts about our Jewish friends. They rejected Jesus Christ and they are lost, but they are a loved people, and they are a people that he made promises to the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Judah, and David. And Abraham means Abraham, Isaac means Isaac, Judah means Judah, and David means David. He made a promise to them that their descendants will inherit this kingdom. Now, some of you may, in fact, have Jewishness in you. Fantastic. This covenant would apply to you. It does not apply to me. I have my own sets of promises, and we read one in verse 27. Sovereignty is given over to the saints. That doesn't matter if you're Jewish or not. My point is that we need to understand what our Jewish friends are going to go through, and we need to stand with them. That does not mean they are a wholly better people, and you cannot misunderstand that. The Star of David is a pagan symbol. They are unbelieving people right now, but they are a people of the promise, and they were promised their Messiah in their kingdom. And when God brings them to faith through the horror that's brought about, we will see a blessing that Paul talked about. If you recall in our time in Romans, Paul prophetically talks about Israel. They've rejected Jesus, so many people have written them off. But Paul says this, I say then, they did not stumble so as to fall away, did they? May it never be. But by their transgression, salvation has come to the Gentiles to make them jealous. Do we understand in the program of God, they rejected Jesus Christ. They said no. They couldn't find an explanation for the miracles, the walking on water, raising the dead, all these wonderful things. So they said he does that by the power of Beelzebul. He's satanically inspired, and they wrote him off. Jesus says, I will come back when you get it right, when you call on me. When you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, I will return, but not until then. Another generation will fulfill the promises made to the Jewish patriarchs. It's important we understand that. Therefore, he hardened their heart. And if you will, I don't know, sometimes I try and cook, help out a little bit, and I'll make one thing, and I'll just have to set it aside and come back to it. And I know as I make something else, I'm going to have to kind of reheat it or do my thing. And so essentially, if I can use that to depict what God did, he put them on the back burner for a season. Why? So that salvation can go to the ends of the earth. So it's all part of this sovereign plan, and we have to stand back and go, wait a minute. What they're going through now is giving the world, including me, an opportunity to hear about Jesus. Yes, that's exactly what Romans is teaching us. And then when this plan comes to fruition, what not to do there. When this plan comes to fruition, it says that all of Israel will be saved. They collectively, as a group, and we'll look at this more in our time in Zechariah, will call out to their Messiah. He will respond to what's left of them, about 1/3, and the 1/3 will enter the kingdom of heaven. And those are the truths of the future that Antiochus Epiphanes depicts as a prototype of what is to come. He ends basically chapter 8 by saying, the visions of the evenings and mornings which has been told is true. Keep the vision secret. Now, at this point he's revealing it, but when he got it, he was kind of told to sit on it, for it pertains to many days in the future. It pertained to many days in his future, but we look at it in the past. It says, then I, Daniel, was exhausted and sick for days. I got up again and carried on the king's business, but I was astounded at the vision, and there was no one really to explain it any further. We have insight now where we understand it through the two advents of Jesus Christ and through the rejection of the Messiah by the Jewish people. So we have more insight. But you know what? I think there still should be a little bit of that same sickening feeling as we watch our Jewish friends absolutely railroaded politically. They offer more rights to visitors in that country, whether you're Palestinian or not, but yet there have been 10 times as many resolutions against them as there are against nations that will not let women even show their face in public, drive a car, go to school. Yet Israel is the one that is real. My point here, and what is our takeaway from this, is to understand and to be there for them. And even to be willing to evangelize them. If you were to take a story like Hanukkah, which they celebrate, even the non-religious ones will typically recognize a couple key holidays. One of them is going to be the Passover. We celebrate around Easter time, and the other is going to be Hanukkah. Learn Hanukkah, know Hanukkah, and actually tell them, do you know why Hanukkah? Do you know why you were persecuted? Do you know what's going to happen again? Build relationships. You know, okay, more about their past and their future than they do. Most, even our practicing Jewish friends today, practice something closer to a cabal, New Age thing than they do the Old Testament. They don't know the Scriptures. They're wandering and they're lost. And we as Christians can speak of their Yahweh, speak of their Messiah, and tell their story to them. And if they come to faith, in that moment, they are given the gift of eternal life. We also need to stop and think once again, and I know I keep coming back to this in Daniel, but it's because the text does. When you look back at verse 27, then the sovereignty, the dominion, the greatness of all the kingdoms under the whole heaven will be given to the people of the saints of the highest one, right? Be an everlasting kingdom. We will have dominion and serve in it. When you look at the warnings in the New Testament, they are talking about this component of Christianity, not your salvation. They are warning you that you could take your portion in this kingdom and disqualify yourself from it. And Jesus says, I'm just going to give it to somebody else. That's what I'm going to do with it. Does not affect the fact that you can go to heaven if you're a believer in Jesus Christ, but you can forfeit your possession in this kingdom because of your lifestyle and your choices.